this passage being so dense and so difficult to easily preach on in one sermon, I decided to stick to verses 12 to 21, but even so, it is still incredibly dense. One of the great passages in what some consider to be the greatest book in the New Testament, if not the whole Bible. Many people have tried to encapsulate the thoughts in this passage under the kinds of headings like 2 men, 2 acts, 2 rewards, and then the other one, the ruin, the rescue, and the reign. You can pick up all the alliterations and the techniques, homily people use to encapsulate the message here. So it's impossible to do it in one sermon. So one just has to choose particular themes and then focus on those. So firstly, I'm going to start off with 2 men. And the 2 men are Adam and Christ, quite obviously. And here's a thought experiment for you. I'm not saying it's disputable, but I certainly ascribe to it. The only 2 men who ever had free will, ever. Think about that. We don't have that. Okay, if we truly reformed, we don't believe we have that at all. They had absolute free will. Okay, that's interesting. I think it was Charles Haddon Spurgeon who said that all men and women hang on the girdles of Christ or Adam. That's it. The girdles being, I think, the belt. I think that's the old-fashioned word. All men and women hang on the girdles of Christ and Adam. And let's not forget, as we see in the genealogy in the book of Matthew, or is it Luke? I think it's Luke, that Adam is considered the Son of God. And that Adam's life and his acts have eternal ramifications. In fact, his one act, where he was given the freedom of will to choose, and he made his choice. I obviously speak representatively. I'm not capitulating to the modern political correctness in saying this, but clearly Adam is representative of the human race, Adam and Eve. So all men and women hang on the girdles of Adam and Christ. That's it. You, sitting here today, hang on the girdle of Christ or of Adam. That's it. It's really that simple. So the applications are this, that through Adam's one act, sin and death entered the world. And there's a strong trend nowadays with theologians like N.T. Wright and others to start to fracture this thinking. Maybe death did exist already, physical death, not spiritual death, they'll say, but physical death. And maybe really this is just a spiritual thing. No, it's very clear. The Reformed doctrine is absolutely clear. Sin and death entered the world through Adam's one act of disobedience. It's the only explanation that makes sense of what's going around us. Just think about this. We have a category and a description for what's happening around us, for what's happening in Ukraine, for what's happening in China, for all the skullduggery that's happening even in the so-called liberated and free societies in our world, with the fixing of elections, with the collapse of our own society, immediate society we see here in South Africa, with the collapse of the infrastructure. We have a category to define and to explain that, and that category is this. It's a simple 3-letter word, S-I-N. It is sin. It was introduced by Adam's one act. And if that seems like an oversimplification, well, so be it. Just think about the average person who is Adam's child, how he or she would define or describe what's happening. this problem would be attributable to that cause and that problem. They just can't see the overarching concept here. That in fact, all of the pain, all of the tragedy, all of the heartache, all of the breakdown of relationships, all of the confusion, all of the utter stupidity that we see around us is due to Adam's one act of disobedience. And when Paul says we sinned in Adam, please do not see yourself as a victim. You are not a victim, you are a villain. Let's get that clear. When we sin in Adam, we perform that act of disobedience on a daily basis. It's not like we inherited it and we're the poor victims of this. We are guilty. And through the doctrines of both original and actual sin, we know we inherit the nature, but we perform the actual acts which vindicate this judgment, that in fact we are the villains. And there is therefore no excuse. Just think of the way the people of Adam would actually try to describe this with such unbelievably vacuous and vague concepts like cognitive dissonance. We can't really understand what's happening. And when someone dies, we go to the funeral and we talk about he being a good fellow, and then we walk away and look at our watches and see our next appointment, and we trivialize it, we pave over it as if it doesn't mean much, but deep down we know. As Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. Deep down we know that this shouldn't be, this mustn't be the way it is. I wouldn't, certainly from the pulpit, advise watching lots of Netflix and Amazon and Disney, etc. Certainly, but occasionally one would see something that comes up that is really worthwhile watching. And you want to watch the utter stupidity of man. See All Quiet on the Western Front, the story of the First World War. It is just mind-boggling how stupid people are. How an armistice is called at the end of the war, and the armistice starts at 11 o'clock, but one German commander wants to have his last little jab at the French, and he commands thousands of men to attack the unsuspecting French in their trenches, and thousands die needlessly. It is said of the First World War that people only gained a couple of 100 meters one way or the other. They were basically fixed for 4 years in their trenches, while thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands, were mercilessly put to death. Now we know, we understand, if one state invades another, the other has to defend itself. We see that in Europe at the moment. We know, we understand that. But there's still nothing clever about it. Forget clever, there's still nothing that is admirable about it. Utter stupidity. And I'm not a pacifist, I'm just saying, isn't this an indication of what Adam did when he resisted God? He chose his own way. He fell for the trap, for the deception that he could know something else in addition to what God had given him, the knowledge of good and evil. And he fell for it willingly. There is a randomness about it. Relationships are messed up. A yawning loss within the hearts of men and women. Deep sense that we are alienated, not only from our Creator, but from each other. And really there is one sin in the Old Testament that stands head and shoulders above the rest. The others all seem to be related to it, and that is the sin of idolatry. And forget the fact that people made these little wooden effigies or whatever it is, these little busts, to worship them. They're all avatars of self. That's the real enemy, self. It is the worship of self. It is, as Don Carson says, and he's one of the people I consulted in preparation for this, Don Carson, John Murray, quite a few others, Kent Hughes, etc. Don Carson said it's the de-godding of God. It is the removal of God from the center and the placement of self at the center. That really is what it's all about. It is a grotesque inversion of the truth where we now are in control of ourselves. And in fact, in one sense, what Satan said was true when he said to them, don't listen to God. You can be in charge. And this is what's happened. In Adam, all have sinned. And we feel on a day-by-day basis, on a minute-by-minute basis, this deep life of desperation. It was Thoreau, the philosopher, who said, all men lead lives of quiet desperation. And then there are the pathetic attempts at escape. We can ignore it, we can pave over it, we can imagine it's not there, or we can go a little bit deeper, try and convince ourselves we're really on top of this, and it just will take thousands of years, and then we'll get on top of it. And here's where the confusion arises, because in effect, wherever the truth is revealed as it is being revealed in this church, in society, there will be improvement. So what they do is they latch onto the improvement. They see there. They've removed the cause of the improvement, and they've just looked at the improvement, and there has been improvement. Certainly in the last 500 years, significant improvement in the quality of life of people. I'm not saying spiritually, I'm just saying generally. Longevity, less war, less pestilence, etc. And they'll grab that and they'll say, but look, the ascent of man, there's the answer. Pity about all the poor people who died in the plagues and the wars, etc. before that, but they made a valuable sacrifice for us, so what we're doing is we're improving. That's the one attempt as well. Other attempts are a lot more crude than that. It is to fill the emptiness with stuff, material value, distractions, whether it's theorizing, whether it's filling the gap, whether it's ignoring it, nothing suffices. That deep, yawning sense of alienation remains. And that is the effect of what Paul is saying here. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. It's so interesting just theologically looking at this. All the great commentators, and I'm talking about people like Martin Lloyd-Jones and John Murray, say that grammatically there's almost a problem here. Paul is introducing it with a parenthesis, and he's putting another parenthesis within a parenthesis, and then he doesn't close the parenthesis, so he's almost got an unfinished thought. So he carries on. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there is no law. And he has to deal with this issue of law because the Jews are reading this and they're saying, no, we just hang on. The law is there to deal with sin. There's the answer. It's the law. Now, Paul's making it very clear that the law is essential. Yes, of course it's essential, but the law doesn't solve the problem. The problem's too deep for that. The law exposes the problem. You know, it's like a man who owns a property, and if someone reverses onto his property with a truck, but he doesn't have a fence, it doesn't mean the man didn't trespass. When he puts the fence up, which is the law, then we know when the man drives over the fence, he has trespassed. We know that. The law just exposes the problem. That's what it does, and it's necessary to expose the problem. But it's not the fix. No, we're way beyond that. Our hearts are so bent on the worship of self, so bent on serving this great idol self that the law is puny against that. It'll just expose it, it'll show a light onto it, and that's of course necessary. We know even in the medical field where there is a disease, it's important to expose the disease first. It's important. You can't do without that, but it's not going to fix it. And that's the very issue that Paul is dealing with here. So we started off with two men. Now we're seeing two works. And the first work was, of course, the work of sin, the disobedience, which ushered into this world this incredible pain that we all are now the recipients of. And that is why the psalmist says we are like sheep to the slaughter. It's a tragedy. You know, there's a lot of rubbish on YouTube and everything, but now and again you see something that is of value. And there's one volunteer soldier in the Ukraine. We don't know what's going on there. There are despicable things going on there. They're only just seeing the evidence of it as they see the mass graves. And they reckon 200,000 dead already. But he was saying the Russians are pouring down phosphor from the skies. And anyone here who's been in the military has seen what phosphor can do. When it lands on you, that's it. It burns through you. There's nothing you can do. And then he's got a little video. He took it with his cell phone. He got a little video, and the interviewer was saying to him, but they're gunshots. What's happening? He says, the men are killing themselves. That's the condition of humanity. It's so easy to talk here about the fact that we perhaps don't have electricity today and we might not have water tomorrow, but that's nothing compared to where it goes. And when the Allied forces entered Nazi Germany, visited Treblinka, Auschwitz, etc., and they saw the grotesque evidence. I don't care what the number was, the grotesque evidence of what was going on. That's what Adam introduced into this world. But then the next work is spoken of, the great work, verse 15. Because death reigned from Adam to Moses, and even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the trespass of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. Adam is only a type in some grotesque kind of antithesis, if you like. But in verse 15 we read, the gracious gift is not like the trespass. For if by the transgression of the one the many died, much more. And this is it, you see. The act of compassion, the act of Christ on the cross dying for the sins of his people. And let's not be misled there. The substitution was enough for the sins of all people in all history, but it was applied for his people. But that act was far surpassing the devastation that preceded it. It had to. It had to. The gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abounds to the many. There are some universalists who have said, well, all sinned. Yes, that's true. So Christ, the gift was for all, therefore all will be saved. No, that's not what's being saying. It's an argument of intent, not an argument of extent. So it's all sinned, and the gift is for all. But, and it's a big but, still there are those who are attached to Adam, and there are those who are attached to Christ. The grace is much, much more. Yes, is it that simple? One life, one death, one resurrection, enough? Yes, more than enough. And that's why we're here today. That's why we're here. It's because the law couldn't do it. We can't do it by getting up in the morning and starting a new leaf and proclaiming that we're going to live differently. We can't do it because the debt is too much. And it was always going to be like this, right from Genesis 3, when Adam actually did fall, and God already says, the serpent will strike his heel, but his heel will crush the serpent. Already it's there. The grace is coming. The great act of compassion is on its way. The plan is in effect. And if it isn't for that, friends, we have no hope. Nothing. We have a few pathetic explanations for what's going on around us. We have this vain hope that over thousands of years man will improve to a point, but we see that history goes through cycles and it goes up and it goes down and it goes up and it goes down, but all the time it never really escapes the trap. This act is what saves us. The gracious gift is not like the transgression. Many have tried to say, well, Adam and Christ are like two sides of the same coin. No, they're not. It's a contrast that is being drawn here. A huge contrast. And the gift, says verse 16, is not like that which came through the one who sinned. For on the one hand, the judgment arose from one transgression, resulting in condemnation. But on the other hand, the gracious gift arose from many transgressions, resulting in justification. And so you've got this opening up into the many and then the closing down into the one. It's a beautiful contrast that is drawn there. For if by the transgression of the one death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one Jesus Christ. That's where we get to the next point. The two rewards. The one reward is death and an eternity without God. And the other reward is life abundant. The forgiveness of sins, the cleansing of the debt, the wiping of the slate clean, a new life in Christ, an ability to conquer sin, to once again restore those relationships that are so damaged, to build bridges again, to join with people, to love one another the way He loved us. The only answer. And so, by way of application, when you're facing those difficulties and you're tempted to grumble because of the difficulty you're facing, and I'm not talking about the tragedy, that's at another level. I'm talking about the difficulties, not enough income, that niggles with your health, the problems with your eyesight, the load shedding, the difficulty with the government that runs the country. These things are there. Yes, they're there because of sin, but when you're troubled about this, look at this. Take stock. Not worth grumbling about. It's not worth getting into a huge tantrum over those things. And also, take stock. Your tendency to grumble is just proof of what we're talking about. It's just proof of how rebellious we are. Proof of how ungrateful we are. Why would this God even bother with creatures like us? I'm sure many of you have seen that clip of the late R.C. Sproul when asked a question in a conference. A bunch of them were asked the question, did God really have to be so hard on Adam and Eve for such a simple thing as what they did? And he exploded. What is wrong with you people? Don't you realize that we deserve death? And yet God extended the hand of compassion. So take stock. So that's the one level. At the next level, it's far worse, I know. Those who've faced tragedy, death, etc., those who've faced terminal disease, those who are facing the real teeth of this ugliness of this problem, not the ripple effects, the real hard, foul breath of it in death of loved ones and so forth. See that in this light as well, because this is the only thing that is going to help you through that. And then thirdly, this is the fuel for sanctification. This is the fuel for you to strive toward holiness. As Paul says in Philippians 3, to actually strive toward that which has already been achieved for you. What an incredible promise that is, which has already been achieved for us. Perfection, sanctification, starting off, of course, with justification, and then ultimately glorification, that we will be with Him forever and ever. And yet we strive. Yet we strive. And that comes to the last point. There are two rewards: death or life. I must apologize for using an analogy from a sermon on the same topic by Don Carson, but it was just too good to ignore. He said he knew of someone once, an academic, which, believe me, having worked with them, turned out to be often the worst, who rationalized the existence of evil away at every turn. Holocaust, she said, it's because of what Nietzsche said, it's the Übermensch, it's the exercise of power, so Germany exercised her power. Any evil act, it's all about power versus power, you just have to overcome one or the other. She just went through life on this ridiculous explanation for everything that just doesn't make sense. But he managed to get her to attend a church, and the pastor very wisely started dropping hints, just talking about things to her. She found it interesting, so she attended a Bible study on the book of Mark. Just found it interesting, disagreed with everything, of course, explaining everything away. And then the story came up, I think the church was supporting some mission somewhere, of a priest who had been exposed, who had sodomized and violated and abused hundreds and hundreds of children over his life. And she was somehow involved in the investigation of this. And her pastor came back to her and said, "And so? Is this evil?" And she resisted it. And again he would come back to her and say, "Is this evil?" And eventually, in terms of her testimony, she said she would spend nights sweating and toiling in her bed, not being able to go to sleep because this one problem confronted her, the thought of those poor children being violated in the name of religion. And eventually she just got on her knees and said, evil exists. And it's that bad. And the solution has to be this good. That's it. So when times are tough, when things are not going well, you come back here and you look here and let this speak to you. Because the promises here are so strong. The remedy is so powerful. You look at the lives of the great saints, John Newton, Augustine, Calvin, all of them, the incredible conversions that took place. There is nothing in all of existence that can change a person like that. It has to come from this. John Newton was so bad that even the non-Christians around him saw his blasphemy and they actually turned away because they couldn't stomach it. He fell overboard once and his captain had to harpoon him in. He still had a wound in his body the size of a fist where the guy harpooned him. He was that close to death. And then later on he turned to Christ, and apparently his marriage was exemplary. His fighting of slavery was exemplary. His conduct was exemplary. That kind of change is due to this. So then, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through the one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men. What an incredible promise. Be encouraged. Let it speak to your life. Let it permeate your life and settle in, permeate, marinate you so much that everything you do is infiltrated with this thinking. As sin reigned in death, even so grace would reign through righteousness to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Every day, remind yourself of that. And if you are hanging on the girdle of Christ, know that your future is good. Know that your present is good, no matter how difficult the circumstances. Just know that you are united with Christ in vital union. And you will be swept up in that incredible power and that incredible vibrancy of life so that you too will live forever and ever. There is one instance of flesh in heaven today, human flesh. It is Jesus Christ, because he's gone there before you and you will follow. Amen.